Good morning, creators. I am Mr. Tsidiso Mputi. We are going to work with you through geography. The sections that I'm going to discuss with you are people and places and people and their needs. We're going to start off with people and places. And I think by now we know that the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about people and places is the topic settlements. But before we go there, let us look at what I have in front on the screen. When we approach our topics, we should follow the basic concepts. What are those concepts? In fact, what the basic steps that we need to follow. That firstly, before doing anything, we need to understand the concept involved in our work. Have an explanation, know what is the concept, what does it mean. And secondly, you have to know the process that are involved when discussing these concepts. Because our work says we need to know a concept. What forms, what processes involved, what happens in that concept, and then what impacts, either how does this impact on us? Do you have positive impacts or negative impacts on us? And again, we need to know how does that influence, how does that impact again on, yes, the environment and humans. And if there are negative impacts, we need to come up again with solutions to the problems that we have. Because what we're doing is we're trying to understand men and the environment. Now I'm going to start off with the concept settlement. Put in simple terms, it's a place where people live. But remember, when we say place where people live, we also need to know that we identify a settlement. There are buildings in a settlement. There are activities that people do in a settlement. And they are all interconnected. Now, which settlements we are going to say, we look at our settlements, we study them, and then we say settlements differ through size and complexity. The simplest form of settlement will be an isolated farmstead. It's the smallest form of settlement. And then you have a hamlet. And then there's a village. There's a town, city, a metropolis, a conurbation, and a megalopolis. So what have we done here? We have listed the settlements from the simplest form to the most complex form, which is the simplest form will be the isolated farmstead, and the most complex form will be the megalopolis. Again, we have to say we have two types of settlements. We have rural settlements and urban settlements. Let's look. Rural settlements are settlements that are single functional, mostly involved in primary activities, and then urban settlements are multifunctional, and then what we find, activities that we find there will be secondary and tertiary activities. The pattern of settlements. The pattern, when we discuss pattern, we say it involves, we are going to say, are our settlements nucleated or are our settlements dispersed? That's when we say pattern. If I might take you further, this is a pattern that we see on the screen now is a pattern that is nucleated, and this is a pattern that is dispersed. Now, most of our settlements are nucleated. We only have a few settlements that are dispersed. I have taken you back and say the isolated farmstead will have a characteristic of being a dispersed settlement. And most of the settlements that you see here, the village, the town, city, metropolis, conurbation, megalopolis, will all have the same pattern, which is nucleated pattern. So that's important to know, that rural settlements, the isolated farmstead is dispersed, and all the other settlements, types of settlements that we have, will be nucleated. Let's go further and discuss rural settlements. We need to understand firstly, what's a rural settlement? We're saying we have two types of rural settlements. We have what we call villages, and then we have what we call an isolated farmstead. Now, how do we differentiate between a village and an isolated farmstead? A village, there's loose patches of land that we find in a village. There's the foreman manages the village in terms of agricultural activities that are there. People in a village, in terms of agricultural activities, cannot take independent decisions, cannot decide on their own what to plant, when and how. It's communal. Everyone owns the farmland. And then there's lots of traveling space from the farmland where they are planting to where to their houses. They can not use machines. Mechanization is impossible in the village. But let's look at the isolated farmsteads. An isolated farmstead will be a large single farm wherein a farmer will manage his own farm, make his independent decisions, and he lives on the farm. So there's no traveling to and from where he's supposed to, from the fields. And then they use machines in an isolated farmstead. Now, one important factor that comes to mind when we discuss settlements is the concept site. If we look there, we see we have tried to explain what is site, and we say site refers to the ground occupied by a settlement. Basically, we're trying to say what is it that makes settlements to be where they are. So we say we need to understand that, and then we say there are things that people need that they look for before they settle anywhere. So those we call the basic needs. Now, the basic needs that we have, that people always look for, would be there has to be water for a person to settle anywhere. There has to be arable land in a matter concerning rural settlements, and then there has to be pasturage, fuel, and building material. Let us look at our imaginary settlement riverside that's on the screen, and then we're going to see there is a settlement. How do I recognize the settlement? I'm looking at buildings. These black boxes that are here. There's a church, there's the market, there's the school, there's a fort, it's an old fort, there's buildings. Now, we are going to say, why have these people settled at this area? And we're going to notice there's water, there's a river, there's arable land here, and there's building material. You see, all these 5 basic needs have been catered for in this settlement. There's water again in the form of a dam. So it's important to say, for rural settlements, what are things that determine the site of a rural settlement, and then we'll refer to the basic needs that for a settlement to be where it is, it needs to be close to water, it needs to have arable land, it needs to have pasturage, and there has to be fuel. When we refer to fuel, we do not necessarily mean petrol, boys and girls. It means there has to be energy, source of energy for them in the area. And then there has to be, again, building materials for their houses. Now let's go further. Now, rural settlements have got particular shapes. Now, you have three basic shapes that we're looking at on the screen now. There's a round shape, there's crossroads, and then there's a linear shape. Now these shapes are either determined by the physical factors that these people build on, like the land that they find themselves in. Look at the round village. Obviously, the settlement people have built around a central point. There's a central point, and then you have fields around the houses there. And then there's again the crossroads. Again, there's roads converging. There's the railroad, and there's the road. And then there's buildings there. So buildings have been built along these intersections of the roads. And then there's again the linear settlement or the linear village when we refer to shape. There's a road and there's a river. So these people have settled. They built their houses along the road. So they have, as a result, the settlement shape became linear. Now, the other important concept that we need to discuss is the dry point and wet point settlement. Now, let us look at the map, the sketch that is on the screen. We're going to notice that there's quite a few settlements around. Remember, how do I see that there's settlements? I'm looking at the buildings that are on the screen. That A, there's a settlement, and C, there's two C's if you're aware. There's two C's, there's a settlement, but there's again D. Now, let us look. This is a river, and this is a road. Remember, we're trying to understand dry point and wet point. Now, if we look at settlement C and settlement D, you see settlement C is close to the river, and settlement D is far away from the river. They have settled at a higher-lying area, and then they are away from the water. So it says a dry point settlement is D. What is a dry point settlement? It's a settlement that is located away from the water source. And usually we find these dry point settlements in an area where water is easily available and might pose as a threat. What threat are we talking about? Like if there's risk of flooding, and then people will move, they build their houses away from where there's water. But in a wet point settlement, these people, it's found in an area where water is scarce. There's shortage of water, so people tend to build their houses close to the water source. So let me just go back and let's look at settlement C, close to the water source. It's going to be a wet point, and settlement D, away from the water source, then we'd say it's a dry point. Remember, dry point away from the water source, wet point, it's close to the water source. Now, again, there's one important thing that we need to understand. Why do people prefer to settle, to build their houses in the middle slopes? And again, not only in the middle slopes, but they'll always say the south-facing slopes, if you are the north-facing slopes, if you are in the southern hemisphere. Let us look at the sketch that we have in front of us. Now we're going to notice that there's a picture showing a house, a settlement that's an isolated farmstead with all the barns and everything, and then there's trees up on both the slopes of our valley, and then there's on the lower reaches of our valley, there's water, so it's supposed to be a river. But let's check, where will people settle on this valley? Remember, in the southern hemisphere, the warmest slopes are facing north. So that is why you have a settlement on, this is the south slope. So this slope is facing the sun, then it is facing north. Then this is the warmest slope in this particular valley. And again, and the upper reaches of the slope, the upper areas of the slope, it's going to be much cold. They say it's too cold. Why is it cold here? Because temperature drops as there is an increase in height. So obviously these areas in the valley, the high areas, the high-lying areas in the valley will always be cold. Why don't they settle there at the low, at the valley floor? It's because, again, it is too cold in the valley floor. There's inversions in the evening. There's most. Let's check again. And then there might be a risk of flooding. There are mosquitoes and there's diseases that they can catch. And then let's look at where are we going to find our crops and everything. You see, crops will be lower, close to the water source, remember, because we need water for irrigation. But the most important thing, they are on the north-facing slopes. Now, having discussed that, we're going to look at a problem that we find in rural areas, which is the problem of rural depopulation. Remember, when we explain the concept to say it's rural depopulation, we explain the concept to be a decrease in the number of rural dwellers. Rural depopulation is not, boys and girls, remember, it is not movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. Movement of people from rural areas to urban areas, we say it's rural urban migration. As it appears on the screen, it says, what is rural urban migration? It's movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. But what then this rural urban migration causes rural depopulation. What is rural depopulation? It's the decrease in numbers of rural dwellers. That's important for us to note. So please do not explain the concept rural depopulation as movement of people from rural to urban areas. It is not. What is movement of people from rural areas to urban areas? That is rural urban migration. Now, let us look at the causes. Factors that cause this movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. We have what we call pull factors. What are pull factors? They are things that attract people to cities. Because what is it that attracts a person to move from a rural area to an urban area? Now let's look at these pull factors. They say people are attracted by better jobs that they might find in urban areas. They are attracted by salaries. There's education. There's medical facilities. There's nice life. You see, the word bright lights doesn't mean that there's only globes. No, it says there's nice, bright life in terms of there's a much better standard of living in cities as compared to rural areas. And then when we refer to education, we say there's tertiary institutions. Most of the tertiary institutions you find in urban areas. Then these are what are factors that we call pull factors. They are factors that attract people to urban areas. And we have factors that force people to move from rural areas. Like we say, those are the push factors. What is it that causes people to move from rural areas to urban areas? What is it that pushes them away? And then we have things like the use of mechanization in rural areas. That since plowing is now done with machines, then it makes it easier for a job that was done by many people to be done by only one person. So they tend to leave. There's low salaries in rural areas. And then there's droughts. Remember drought? When there's little or no rainfall, crops die, and then production becomes low, and then people are left without employment. So they have to move to better areas or to urban areas and try and find employment. The other thing that may cause movement will be crime. And again, the other factor that we always mention when we do our work is unemployment. So those are what we call the push factors. Now, how does this impact on rural areas? What are the consequences? What are the results? Consequences sounds like a big word, but it's very simply put. What are the results? How are rural areas left as people move from rural areas to urban areas? Now, we are going to see that houses will be empty. There's going to be empty farmhouses. There's going to be crime. Now, I have put in brackets things like farm murders, because there's few people. Quite a lot of wrong things will go unnoticed as people are left. There's few people left in the rural areas. The other thing that's obviously there's unemployment. Now there's few new investment. What do we mean when we say there's few new investment? We mean there's no new businesses that are opening in rural areas because people are moving. Remember we said people are moving. So obviously no one will come and invest in rural areas. There's many old people because most of the movement, most of the people who are moving to urban areas will be young people. And then hence you'd have few young men. There's low value of properties. Houses will be sold at very low prices. And then shops obviously will close because there's no business. Schools will be half empty, or at times schools are empty. And then you'd have services that are below standard. This is what happens in rural areas. It's important to remember this is what happens in rural areas when people leave. And then, guys, I would urge you to do this. Most of the Free State, most of us in the Free State, we are in rural areas. Most of the areas in the Free State are rural areas. We are talking about things that we are seeing every day. This is what we see every day, that we have our uncles, we have our parents at times working in urban areas like cities, Bloemfontein, Johannesburg. But how are the areas that are rural areas that they leave? How are they like once they leave? Then you notice that there's children who are left with grannies. There's houses that have been abandoned. This is the consequences. That's what we're referring to. What I'm urging you to do is say, do not divorce this from the life, from our real experiences. It's what is really happening in rural areas. That is the consequences. And then let's check, what is it that we can do to try and slow down this rural urban migration, or to try and slow down rural depopulation? Now we're looking at a slide that says we have to advertise our rural areas so that people can come and invest in these rural areas. There has to be recreation. I know of one place where they had this cherry festival. I think it was some weeks back, where they are trying to have these festivals so that they can have people coming into these rural areas and investing. So you see, we'd have those festivals. Others would encourage fun runs or anything that could just bring people back to rural areas. And you have tourism. You have areas like where people come, have tourist attractions in those areas, and let people come and visit from urban. Let people from urban areas come in and visit our rural areas. Now, you need to restore the buildings. There has to be development of rural schools, and then again to encourage people coming back or people not living rural areas. Will have cheap industrial sites. Now, let us look at the pictures as evidence. Now I'm showing evidence. What do we mean when we say look at the picture one, there's a farmhouse that's been deserted. People have left, basically, and then there's dilapidated buildings. Dilapidated buildings is something like this, a destroyed building. There's no roofing, no windows, nothing. See that man sitting on the stoop doing nothing? And then there's shops that are closing. Most rural areas would find this situation, that in some little towns that we go to, there's shops that have closed down and no business people are not working. And then look at this picture. You see, farmers are trying ecotourism. Like there's advertisement of things that people can do when they come and visit this particular place, and that's it. Now let's go on. Again, we are going to look at problems in developing, problems that we find in rural areas. Let me just check something. Yes, this is the slide that I wanted us to look before we discuss problems that we find in rural areas. Let's look at this. This is a town called Clarence. It's a small town. Remember, we were discussing rural depopulation. Say, what can be done to slow down rural depopulation? Look at the town Clarence. What are they doing? What was done in Clarence to combat rural depopulation? Do you see? Can you see what is it that's been done? There's a bed and breakfast in Clarence. Why a bed and breakfast? Because I think these people in this area, they have firstly advertised their town. Welcome to the Ark Mecca and Adventure Capital. And what is it again? They're saying you can come. There's accommodation for you to sleep. You can play golf. There's tourism. You see, there's country shops. There's a health and homeopath spa. Now what are they doing? They are trying to advertise their town, and the factors that we discussed, that tourism will play a part in trying to stop, in fact, in trying to redevelop the life in rural areas. So it's important for us to note that. Fine. Now let us look at the problems that people find in rural areas. We're going to try and look at the problems and the solutions that we have in rural areas. I would really appreciate it, boys and girls, if you could just interact. Like if there's something you need to say, comment, or ask me to go back to something so that we discuss any concept, then I'll be very happy to do that. So let us just go on. We're looking at problems that we find in developing rural areas. Remember, in the past we used to have what we call homelands. Remember homelands? Well, you're probably not here on earth by the time we had homelands. But then we had areas where that were designed, designated for certain language, racial groups. So you had these homelands that were rural areas that are developing. In South Africa, we had commercial farms, and then we had these homelands, and we refer to these homelands as developing rural areas. An example would be areas like Kwakwa, that was a homeland. It's a rural area and it's developing. What is the problem that these people find in these areas? The first one is lack of land. There's no land for farming for these people. Like if you read, let's read this slide together. It says most rural farmers in South Africa have access to very small amounts of land. This is because most of the farmland is owned by white commercial farmers. Remember, we're talking former homelands. Now, there's quite a lot of people crammed in an area, or there's little farmland, and sometimes the land that they find themselves in is not really arable land. So that's problem number one, lack of land that people find in rural areas. Problem number two, obviously, because there's shortage of land, there is going to be low productivity. What do we mean when we say low productivity? We mean that when they plant, there's not enough there's not enough food produced for them, by them, in fact, to sell. Now, why is that the case? Because they're using traditional farming methods. Remember, subsistence farming, commercial farming, we're still going to discuss that later on. And then there's lack of machinery. They do not have machines. Remember, most of these settlements that we're talking about now, it's people who find themselves in villages. So there's poor seeds, there's poor cattle, there's lack of machinery, there's no irrigation methods. We mostly would say they depend on rain for irrigation. Fine, this is problem number two. Remember, we're saying there's problem number two. What is it? It's low productivity. What causes the low productivity in developing rural areas? It's because these people use traditional farming methods. What do we mean when we say traditional farming methods? We mean that they use those whole subsistence farmers. They do not plant. They plant different things at the same time. No crop rotation, nothing. Now, again, they do not have enough machines. There's no tractors. They have poor seeds. They have poor cattle. No irrigation methods. Fine, let me go on. The other problem is overpopulation of these rural areas. That there's too much people crammed in a little area. Now, why do we say overpopulation in this case as a problem in rural areas? Because it leads to overgrazing in the land, overusing of the soil, removal of natural vegetation, and general damage to the landscape. In extreme cases, this overpopulation will lead to what we say is desertification. That's when now the land is bare, there's barren, there's nothing. So say it's desertification. Remember, we're doing problem number three. We said it's overpopulation. Why is this a problem? Because it leads to overgrazing of the land. Again, the soil is overused. As a result, soil is going to lose its fertility. And then there's removal of natural vegetation because people need space. So they'll remove the trees, the grass, maybe to build the houses or anything. And then there's going to be a general damage to the landscape. And in extreme cases, it may lead to desertification. Fine, let's go on. Problem number 4. Rural areas do not have enough services. Guys, remember, we're talking problems that we find in rural areas. So we said, again, the other thing that comes is that there's lack of services. I think people will understand that what we mean by services. We mean there's shortage of running water, there's no sanitation, there's shortage of electricity. The schools that we find in rural areas are not in good condition. There's few clinics, there's shortage of transport. These are the services that we mean, or that we refer to when we say there's lack of services in these rural areas. Let's look at problem number 5. I think this is again another problem. There's high levels of unemployment or high rates of unemployment. What do we mean? Remember, we said that because of the use of machinery, people are going to lose their work. And then it says here, the farmlands are overcrowded. So that is why men are forced to go to urban areas in search of employment. The farming is left to the women and children. And then again, this will lead to what? to the disruption of family life. This is situations that we have in most rural areas where the father leaves for 6 months, comes back, or sometimes only comes once a month. You see, that's what we mean. We say disruption of family life. Fine. Let's go on. This is another problem. HIV and AIDS. If we look at South Africa as a country, we'll find that most of the high areas with high rates of HIV and AIDS infection are rural areas. Why is this the case? Because, okay, let me just read the slide. Say, infection rates are a major problem in many rural areas where they are extremely high. Why is that the case? Because of low education levels of the people in rural areas. Now, what does that mean? Is that it means that we say there's low literacy rates, there's lack of medical care, adequate medical care. There's shortage of clinics, shortage of doctors, shortage of medication. Then say there's lack of medical care. There's migrant workers. Migrant workers, it's an important concept. Remember, we need to know what's a migrant worker. That's where you're going to say it's someone who leaves the area that they live in to find work in urban areas. So they migrate, they move for work, for in search of what? Of employment. Now, this is important because, guys, I want to just stay a bit on this HIV and AIDS problem, because we might be expected to say, how does this impact on rural areas? What causes high levels of HIV and AIDS in rural areas? We say these high levels are caused by low education levels, low literacy rates, lack of medical care, and then this other thing, migrant laborers or migrant workers have an impact, or it's a cause of HIV and AIDS in rural areas. But then, how does this have an impact on rural areas? HIV and AIDS. Now, we say it will lead to lower productivity. Remember, productivity, we're referring to the amount of yields, what is being produced in the farms will be low, like they'll have lower productivity. And then, because people, we expect that there's going to be a lot of people who will be ill and not have enough strength to work. And then again, there's going to be a lot of orphans who are left to take care of themselves. Then this is the impact of HIV and AIDS, where in rural areas. That's that. And then let us remember, we have identified the problems, but what do you think should be the solutions to our problems? Now, let's look. They say the focus is on developing rural areas as a solution to the problems that have been identified. What are we saying here? We say for us to solve the problems that we have, we need to develop rural areas to be better areas so that we can solve all the problems that we have mentioned. Now, we have, remember, 1994, new government came in, and then there were strategies before 1994. Let's look at them. And then there's the concept decentralization. I just need to, I wanted to highlight that so that it can be clear. But then I hope everyone can see there's decentralization. What is decentralization? It says we are going to spread. We need to spread industries, the spreading of industries and other forms of development across several areas rather than in one central area only. Look at the situation that we have in South Africa, that you have 4 areas. We have few areas that are highly developed. So with decentralization says not only these core areas in South Africa should be developed, but there has to be development in all areas of our country. Maybe that will help to solve the problems that we mentioned earlier on. And again, there has to be agricultural planning. Again, I hope it is clear. what we're looking at. And then what does it say? It says planned villages are established with families being given a piece of land and the basic amenities with which to farm. I need to pass that one. Remember, after 1994, we had a change of philosophy. In a sense, there was a change in the approach of how things were done. Now, I am going to say with rural areas, we were looking at productivity. Remember, as we were discussing this, I was saying there's going to be low productivity because of age. There's going to be low productivity because of rural-urban migration. And then there's people who argued. They said, no, we're focusing on the wrong things. Let's focus on basic needs. It says people that argued that there was too much emphasis placed on economic development of rural areas, but we should rather look at the basic needs of people. What are these basic needs that we're talking about? The basic needs that people need in rural areas or everywhere in South Africa, for that matter, is people need to have clean drinking water. There has to be sanitation. Everyone needs to have that. There has to be housing. People need employment, people need education, and there has to be enough food and healthcare. These are the basic needs that people need, that everyone needs to have. Why are we talking about the basic needs, boys and girls? It's because we're saying we need to come with solutions to the problems that we mentioned earlier on. That for us to solve those problems, for us to solve the problem of HIV and AIDS, for us to solve the problem of low productivity, for us to solve this, we have to make sure that rural areas are afforded with these basic needs. Now, for us to give people these basic needs, the government introduced a number of developmental strategies that were all guided by what? By the basic needs approach. Now we're just going to mention these strategies, and we are going to discuss them in detail later on. What are these try look? Remember, reconstruction and development program. It's very embarrassing for us when we're marking and people have to explain what does RDP stand for. And quite a lot of grade 12s do not get it right. I do not know why. So it's important. Remember, reconstruction and development program. Yes, I said we're going to discuss these programs. What are these programs aimed at? They are aimed at developing poor rural areas in South Africa. And then we have the integrated rural development program. Just make sure that you know these concepts. These strategies, like, what is RDP, what's the purpose, and then what do the acronyms stand for? RDP, what does it stand for? What does IRDP stand for? It says Integrated Rural Development Program. What is GEAR? Growth and Employment and Redistribution. And then you have these SDIs, Special Development Initiatives. We have the IDZs, the Industrial Development Zones. We are going to discuss these things in further details later on. But what we're looking at, we're saying these are the strategies that were put in place for, in fact, to try and solve the problems that we had in rural areas. Now, we are moving on. We have to skip this one, and now let's look. As we move on, the next part of our work, we are going to focus on urban settlements. But before we go on, can I just take a few steps back? Remember, we said things that we need to know when we talk about rural settlements. We need to know the shape. Let me go back. Let me just quickly rush back. Let me just do this so that I can get to where I want as quickly as possible. Yes, this is where I want to be, right here. Let's look at that. We discussed the most important thing here, I think, would be rural depopulation as a concept. Remember, we said there are push and pull factors that are important. You need to know what are the pull factors. In fact, explain. What are pull factors? They are factors that attract people to urban areas. And then what are push factors? It's factors that push people, that force people to move to rural areas. And then you have to mention those factors, like there's better jobs as a pull factor, there's high salaries, education, medical facilities, bright lights, and everything. And then again, there's mechanization as a push factor, and again, low salaries, droughts, crime, unemployment, these will be push factors. Now, again, you need to know how are rural areas, when left as people live, how are they like? What's the conditions in rural areas because of rural depopulation? There you have them. You'd see it's empty farmhouses. There's going to be crime, unemployment, few new investments, many old people, and all those things that appear on the screen now. And then again, what's important is what can be done. What is it that we need to do to solve this problem? And then there you have it. There's advertise the town, recreation. We can attract people through recreation and tourism. You see, we restore the old buildings, invest more in rural schools, like re-equip them, and then you have cheap industries. That's sorry. I just wanted us to recap. And then remember the problems that we discussed, that there's lack of land, low productivity, there's overpopulation, there's lack of services, there's high rates of unemployment in rural areas. These are the problems that we find in rural areas. And then remember, we need to come up with solutions thereof. Hence, we were talking about RDP, IRDP, gear, all those things are aimed at solving the problems in rural areas. Now, the next segment, we're going to talk about urban settlements, but I think before we go there, we're just going I'm sorry, we're just going to have a break, and then we're going to come back and discuss urban settlements. We're going to look at urban settlements. If you look at the picture, it's a nice picture showing an urban settlement. You see the buildings, tall buildings. Looks like a very beautiful place if you look at it from a distance. You see? Yeah, these are urban settlements. And there's a huge contrast, remember, between urban settlements and rural settlements. Why am I saying urban? I'm looking at the buildings. Guys, remember, I am not saying there's people here. Why? How can I identify the settlement? It's because I am looking at the buildings. So how do we identify our settlements? The buildings tell us that this is a settlement. And what type of a settlement? Obviously, we look at the buildings and they'll show us that, oh, because this one has got tall buildings and nice streets, then it is indeed an urban settlement. And then we're going to discuss this after our break. I think we're going to break for 10 minutes. Welcome back, Rachels. I hope you were able to go and drink some water so that you can go again and work. Like I said, we are going to look at urban settlements as our next topic. Now, we are going to look at the following. In this session, what is it that we're going to look at? We're going to look at concepts, urbanization, urban growth, urban expansion. We're going to look, we have to understand what do we mean when we say there's an urban profile. We're going to look at street patterns that we find in urban areas, factors that affect or influence the location of land use zones that we have in urban areas. Remember, that's where we're going to talk about central business district, industrial areas, and then we're going to look at gentrification, filtering, invasion and succession. We're going to look at models that we have in urban areas. Again, issues, problems that we have in urban areas, and we're going to look at what? At the solutions thereof. Remember when we started, I said to you, we first do what? We study the concept, understand it, look at the processes that are involved in the concept, and then we look at the issues that might arise, the problems that might arise, and how do they affect us. And then lastly, you have to know the solutions thereof, of the problems that we have identified. Now, as we start, now let's look at the concepts. What I have in front of us is two concepts. Now, in brackets, I have put percentage on the first concept, and the second concept I've just written numbers. What is it? We need to understand the concept urbanization. What is urbanization? We say it's a process in which an increasing proportion of the country's population is concentrated in urban areas. It is caused by rural-urban migration. What do we mean when we say a percentage? We say, suppose 60% of the people living in 60% of the total population in South Africa is in urban areas. So we would say that is the rate of urbanization. In a sense, we say when we talk of urbanization, we do not say, again, I am going to say this in capital letters. This is urbanization is not movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. Remember that concept, movement of people to rural areas from rural areas to urban areas is rural-urban migration. But what is urbanization? It's a process in which an increasing proportion of the country's population is concentrated in urban areas. Now we have another concept, which is urban growth. Now, with urban growth, we say we're looking at numbers. It refers to the increase in actual numbers of people living in cities due to urbanization and natural increase. What is natural increase? Natural increase of population is when there's birth, there's children being born, there's an increase in the numbers of people through birth rates. If, say, we have a high birth rate, there's high natural increase. If there's low birth rate, we'd say there's low natural increase. And again, now what is urban? The numbers of people in urban areas are growing because of that. So we say that is urban growth. Thus, we say it's the increase in the number of people living in urban areas. Now we have another concept, that is urban expansion and urban sprawl. We need to understand these concepts. Urban expansion will mean when the area, the size of the urban area increases, like this, because these are related. It's very important to understand. Once there's more people, obviously the size will have to increase. When the size increases, we'd say it's urban expansion. Like it says, it is the increase in the actual physical size of an urban area. And then again, we have what we call the concept urban sprawl. What is urban sprawl? It's unplanned spread of an urban area. This will be a result. Remember, we have shorter view space, and then people just settle around the urban area. As a result, it sprawls. Usually when we make an example of something that sprawls, you know, the pumpkin plant, as it grows, it sprawls. It's not planned. It just spreads around the garden. It sprawls. That's what we mean by urban sprawl. It's something that grows unplanned and just covers a much bigger area than it had covered before. Now, what is it that we? One thing again that we're also going to look at is basically the shapes that we find in urban settlements. Now, I have noted two more important shapes that we're going to look at. We say we have a linear shape and a round shape. Now, on the screen now we have just a caption of a PAL, topographic map of PAL. Now, let us look at the place itself. If you look on the eastern side, there's mountains. There's quite a lot of mountains on this map on the eastern side, and then there's again on the left side of the map there's Paarlberg. Again, there's a mountain. Do you see the area that has been buffered? That's the cordoned area there. Now that is where we expect to find our settlements. Look, there's vineyards. You see those gray little things? They represent vineyards where there's farms where they sell grapes. Now let's look. Now, because of we're trying to understand a linear shaped urban settlement. Now, because of these two barriers, the mountains on both sides, our settlement cannot go anywhere. It just has to follow the shape of the mountain. Hence, you have a linear shape. That is that. So, what are we saying? Saying a linear urban settlement is determined by the physical barriers that are found there. Like with this one, there is mountains on both sides, and then people will just have to settle between those mountains, and then they will follow a shape. The settlement, in fact, will form a shape that is linear. Now, the other form of shape that we have, or it's a shape that is round. Now, let us look at our imaginary settlement. Now, do you see A? It says, guys, one important thing that I want to mention before we go further is that most of our questions have got diagrams and pictures and everything. So the most important thing for us to do before we answer any questions is that we need to understand what's in the picture. So let's look at the picture that we have and try and understand what we're looking at. Now, there's quite a lot of shadings and squares and everything. For a person who doesn't know, we'd say, let's refer to the key. Now, our pictures have got keys. Do you see the black shaded? There it says it's the central business district, and then you have residential areas and everything. Now we're trying to understand the shape that is round. How come we have a round shape? Now look at the roads. There's the roads. Now, what happens is there's a circle. Now, our settlement, people is going to assume a round shape because people are building around the central point, which is the CBD. So everything is around this central point, our central business district. So it will assume a round shape. Look, all the roads are coming in and everything is around the CBD. So just to recap, let's go back to, then we say we have shapes of settlements. We said we have a linear settlement and we have a round settlement. A linear shaped settlement will be determined by the physical barriers. Example, we said Paarl has a linear shape because there's mountains on both sides of the settlement. And then we said we have a circular shape or a round urban settlement, and that is caused by the reason there's all the activities, all the things, or all the buildings are around the CBD, which is the central point of that particular settlement. Now let us go on. One interesting thing that we need to understand are the street plans or the street patterns. Now, what are urban? They are determined by the physical relief. The build of an urban area will determine the street patterns, the planning by of specific urban areas, and the changing needs of the inhabitants of that urban area. Now, what plans do we have? We have a grid pattern. We have irregular. Now, irregular pattern comes either it is planned or unplanned, and then we have a cobweb or radial street pattern. Now, let us start with the grid pattern. Let us look at the street plan. We're trying to understand the grid pattern. The first one that comes, we said we have irregular. Can you see irregular? And then we have, now let's say we found usually places that are steep slopes, and then you have a grid pattern. Can you see the difference between irregular and grid? Do you see grid forms squares? There's quite a lot of squares that do streets. They intersect at right angles. Most of the towns that we have or cities that we have in South Africa have got this pattern. This is the most common pattern, the grid pattern. And then there's the regular pattern. Let's see if we can identify the other pattern. There it says the grid pattern. It's found again on even ground, flat surfaces mostly. Now, what I have here is a map of Johannesburg. I'm going to try and enlarge the slide. See if we can go. I'm going to try and do what? Enlarge the slide. This is Johannesburg. We're going to look at, oh, where is it taking me? I just want it to be bigger. Oh, am I winning? Yes, I think I am. Now, we're looking at Johannesburg. As a city. Now, what is it that I'm looking for? I'm looking for different street patterns. Look here, there's grid pattern. Can you see that? And then if you go to the edges of the city, there's irregular pattern. There's irregular again. There's grid. Why am I showing this, boys and girls? Is because we need to understand the oldest part of the cities that we have. The old part, the first part where the settlement started in the city, will always have a grid pattern, because that's the old form of street pattern that we had. And then as a city develops, the outer layers, the edges of the city, then we are going to have a pattern that is irregular. It can either be planned irregular or just irregular pattern. Why is that the case? It's because as we develop, we notice that the grid street pattern has got quite a lot of problems. Remember, we need to understand, we need to mention the grid, the problems that we find with the grid pattern. That is when we're going to say the grid street pattern. I'm trying to write here. Okay, let me just rotate this and then say grid pattern. The grid pattern, and then say, remember, grid street pattern, what does it do? We said number one, it causes traffic traffic jams, remember, because it is slow. Oh, the grid pattern causes traffic jams, and then it is slow. I'm going to, yes, it is slow movement of traffic, slow movement of cars. Please do not forget these things, that what are the disadvantages of the grid pattern? And then we say it causes traffic jam, slow, causes what again? There's quite a lot of accidents because cars will be bumping into each other. So we have accidents as a result of what? Of the grid pattern. This is the straight pattern that we have mentioned. These are the problems that we find. But as an advantage, it says is it's easy to find places because of the grid pattern. One other thing that's a disadvantage is that in an urban area where the street patterns have formed a grid, these areas, you cannot really build anything. They cannot easily, it's not easy to expand the urban area. It is not easy. We cannot easily expand. So it's not easy to do what? Not easy to expand the urban area in the grid pattern. But with the irregular pattern, it has advantages. It has advantages that there is less accidents. Guys, I'm not going to say there are no accidents because we know accidents do happen on the road. So we say the irregular street pattern, there's going to be less accidents, but again, it is there's less traffic jams. There's less traffic jams. And then again, as a disadvantage of this, it's because the streets are irregular. It takes time. You can lose your direction. Yeah, you can get lost easily. So you can lose your direction. You can get lost easily, lose direction easily. And then you say, that is that. What am I trying to say to you guys? I'm trying to say to you, with the street patterns, we need to know the advantage of the grid pattern. We need to know the advantage of the grid pattern and the disadvantages of the grid pattern. The advantage of the irregular pattern and the disadvantages of the irregular pattern. And again, what's important, we're saying the oldest part of the city will always have a grid pattern, and the edges of the city where there was new development in the city, it will have an irregular street pattern. Fine, let us go on. Now, the next thing that we have to discuss as we go on is the urban profile. What is urban profile? We're looking at the city from the side. We're looking at it from the side. And what is it that we notice? Now, let us look at the picture that we have in front of us, the slide that we have. We're going to notice that we have the land use zones in the city. There's the central business district. It is always at the center. Can you see? That is why we say it's the central business district, because where it is situated at the center of the city. And then on either sides, on both sides, you have the industries, and then you have again another land use zones, which is the residential area. Can you see? There's housing, there's flats, and then there's housing on either side. But when we talk of urban profile, what is it that we exactly look at? We're looking at the shape of the urban area, the side view of the urban area. We're looking at the shape from the side. And what is it that we notice? That there's tall buildings at the center, and then as you move away from the center, look, buildings become lower. They decrease in size as they assume more horizontal shape rather than a more vertical shape. Then why is that the case? Now let's look at the notes that they've prepared for us. They say The reason why we have tall buildings at the center is because, number one, the land is expensive. Now, again, the CBD, remember, this is the heart of the city. So everyone wants to be there. Businesses want to locate there. It's much easier for everyone goes to the CBD. So there's going to be competition for space. Since there's competition for space, and again, number two factor, that there's expensive land, then people are going to build the land will be used intensively. As a result, we are going to have vertical buildings at the center of the CBD. That is why you have high buildings at the center, tall buildings, because they want to use maximum space, they will have maximum use of space. Hence, the result, you have tall buildings. And why is the land expensive at the CBD? It's because everyone wants to get there. So there's competition for space. But as we move away from the CBD, what is it that we notice? That the land values become cheaper as we move away from the CBD. Hence, the buildings are horizontal. Now, let us look there. Now, the further you move away from the CBD, the land values become cheaper. So, this is what we look, as we're looking at this, there it comes. It says, the further you move away from the city center, the buildings become lower and cheaper. Now, the next thing that comes is land use zones. But before we go there, I was looking at a question paper and it was showing the land use zones. Let's look at this. There's the land use zones. Now, it shows an event profile. I hope we all can see the event profile. That there's your CBD. It's high, tall buildings. Can you see that? It's tall buildings at the CBD. And as I move away from the CBD, can you see that? There's a reduction in the size, like the decrease in the size of the buildings. It goes low. And here we have high density of buildings. What do I mean when I say there's high density? There's quite a lot of buildings. They're clustered in one area around in the CBD. And then this is what we call an urban profile. That's important for us. And remember, if we have to explain why is this land expensive, we're going to say it's expensive because there's competition here. Everyone wants to have space at the CBD, to have land at the CBD. So the land values will be expensive. And then let's go back to a slide, and then we're going to talk about something else that's very interesting, which is the land use zones. Now, what are land use zones? We say it's areas in a city that have specific functions. What land use zones do we have? The first land use zone is the central business district. What is a central business district? They say it's the most accessible part of the city. It's at the center. It has highest buildings and it has high order functions and low order functions. We're going to discuss these concepts, high order functions and low order functions, later on. For now, we just need to know that at the CBD, at the center of the city, there are high order functions and low order functions. And then how do you recognize this? We are going to say we can see the CBD because of its tall buildings. Another land use zones that we find, another activities that we find basically in the city are industries. Now, these industries are separated into two. You have we have light industries, and again we have heavy industries. And there are factors that that really influence the location of the industries. Like we know, light industries, we're going to find them closer to the CBD. There are reasons for that. We're going to discuss them later on. And then heavy industries will always find away from the CBD. So what are we saying now? Saying with land use zones, industries, there's two types of industries, industrial land use zones in the city. There's a land use zones for light industry, and there's a land use zone for heavy industry. And then we have retail. Retail shops, basically in simple terms. When we refer to retail, we say in a city there are shops. The shops, this city, we can find these shops where in the CBD, or we can find them away where you have isolated stores. Remember the malls that we go to, say if a person, like in Bloemfontein, people go to Mimosa. It's a retail that is away from the CBD, you see? Then that's what we expect to find in as a land. That is again a land use zone. Again, we have residential areas in the CBD. Remember, there's residential areas we differentiate according to income. That there's high income residential areas, and then where do we find them? You see, there's where, and then there's low income residential areas, and then there's informal settlements. We're going to discuss this into details. We just now mentioning the land use zones that we find in cities, and again there's a zone of decay. Where do we find the zone of decay? It's found at the edge of the, just next to the CBD. What is the characteristic of this zone of decay? It is characterized by old buildings. It has mixed functions, and then it's an area where there's renovations from time to time. The city, the authorities are trying to renew this area because it's not nice. And then again, the other area that we find, or the other zone that we find of a city, is the rural urban fringe zone. Remember, rural urban fringe, now it's that area that is between where the city ends and a rural area begins, or where the rural area ends or a city begins. What do we find there? We find that you have a golf course. Wherever you see a golf course, power stations, the cemeteries, the airports, you know that is space that is called a rural urban fringe zone. Just recap, we said we have land use zones. What are land use zones? They are areas in which we find specific functions in a city. Like, for example, we have a land use zone that is a central business district. We say it's a CBD. And then we have land use zones for industries. We have light industries and heavy industries. Again, we have land use zones for retail, where you find malls. I would like to, let's just use the term malls because it's something that we're familiar with, where you go to shopping centers and then there you find shops. That is part of the city. And then again, we have residential areas. We either have areas where you have high income residential areas, low income residential areas, and then we have again informal settlements. And then another zone, we say it's a zone of decay. It's found at the edge of the city. It has old buildings, there's mixed functions, and it is always an area that is being renovated or renewed. And lastly, we said we have the rural urban fringe zone. This is the space that we find between the rural and urban areas. How do we identify this rural urban fringe zone? Obviously, we're going to say we expect to find a golf course or a power station, or the cemeteries, or there's an airport at this area. Now, let's look at factors again. What are the factors that influence the locations of these zones that we have discussed? Remember, we said we have land use zones. Why are they located where they are? That's what we're trying to say basically. What are the factors that influence the location of these land use zones? Now remember, this is a nice concept. We have a centripetal forces and we have centrifugal forces, and we have land values. What are centripetal forces? They say these forces, they are forces that tend to keep certain functions. They attract certain functions to the city center, like magnetism, accessibility, convenience, and prestige. Remember, what is functional magnetism? You know, when I want to find a bank, a particular bank in any city, once I can see one bank in a city, I know there has to be another, like, let me just say, if I want to find Standard Bank in a city, once I can find NetBank or ABSA, I'll know just around there has to be a Standard Bank. That is functional magnetism. What am I saying? I'm trying to say to you, certain activities attract each other. They are found close to each other, just next to each other. That is functional magnetism. So most of the functions in cities will be there because there are other functions that are the same as them. And then accessibility. What is accessibility? Because the urban areas or the central business district is much accessible. So it means people will want to have their shops there or their businesses there because they know everyone passes through there. So it's going to be easier for them to sell whatever they have or to open their businesses. We say these forces that we're talking about are centripetal forces, and then we have again centrifugal forces. What are centrifugal forces? They are factors that cause functions to move away from the city center to the outskirts or the periphery of the urban area. What makes functions to move away from the from the city center? Remember, there's high rent. So if the rent is expensive, then people will try and locate where there's cheaper rent. And then this is always a problem, that there's traffic congestion. And then once there's traffic congestion, people will try and find areas where there's less congestion. The high taxes that they have to pay, pollution, the crime, the lack of space, then these are factors that will cause people to move away from the city center. Guys, remember, we're not talking movement to rural areas. We're talking movement to the periphery or the edges of the city. So we are saying that there are forces that attract, which are centripetal forces, and there are forces that cause functions to move away. They are centrifugal forces. As we go on, there's our CBD. Now, we are going to discuss these land use zones in details. Now, let's start. We have our CBD. Can you see the CBD? It's at the center. One thing that's important about our CBD, can you see that the roads, everything is converging into the CBD? All roads do what? They lead into that is why we say this is the most accessible part of the CBD. Can you see that? There, we say this is the most accessible. Why are we saying that? Remember, accessible. And the CBD has got high buildings, and almost all functions that you find in a city, you'll find in the CBD. Let's go on. Now, there's a picture of a CBD. I know there's people in rural areas who've never been to, say, a city. Now you know what a CBD looks like. You see the picture. There's tall buildings. Remember we say the roads, all roads converge. Look, there's my roads. Look at the roads that we find here. Yeah? And you can easily see the street pattern. It's grid pattern. Can you see that? Yeah, it's easy to identify. And then there's the high buildings that we're talking about. There's the high density. Remember, when we say high density of buildings, say there's quite a lot of buildings in one area. Look, there's quite a lot of buildings in this. And then there's quite a lot of functions here. There's, remember, the head offices of companies you find there. There's shops. There's quite a lot of things. And then, remember, traffic jams. Obviously, we're going to have traffic jams here because there's quite a lot of activities and a lot of cars coming in at this central business district. Let's move on. Again, we have another land use zones. Remember, we said industrial zone. Now, industries, there's two. We have light industries and heavy industries. Now, let's look at industry. Heavy industries will be located far away from the CBD. There are obvious reasons. Remember, heavy industries require a lot of space. Heavy industries, so cities, at the CBD, the land values are expensive, so they really cannot afford to have a lot of space for industries at that area. Now, the other thing is that they cause a lot of noise. So since they are noisy and they cause a lot of pollution, really we cannot have them close to the city center. Now, what is it that these people, or what is it that heavy industries need for them to be located where they are, far away from the city? Remember, heavy industries, they need, or light industries obviously will be closer to the CBD because they do not have a lot of pollution. Now, there's industries, there they are. Now, remember the heavy and light industries. We're going to talk about industries later on, but what are we saying now? We're saying that light industries are located closer to the CBD and heavy industries are located far away from the CBD. Why is that the case? Because heavy industries, they cause a lot of pollution, they need large space, they need cheaper land, and then they have again to be close to the roads, and they have to be close to the water sources, so they'll be far away from the city. And then light industries will be closer to the city because they do not cause much pollution, there's little noise, and then they usually, why are they here again? It's because they produce perishable goods. Remember, they need to be close to the market, which is what? Which is the CBD. Let's go on and look. We have another zone, a zone of decay. Can you see the red line, the red dotted line that is around the CBD? Do you see that line? It symbolizes the zone of decay. What does it say? The zone of decay is a zone that is around the CBD, just outside the central business district. It has mixed functions. What do we mean when we say it's mixed functions? You find there's industries, the shops, there's quite a lot of things happening around that area. And then there's old buildings. But again, the most interesting thing about the zone of decay is that the land that we find there, the land values are high. It has expensive land. Why is it expensive? Because remember, when the city has to expand, the CBD has to expand, it's going to expand into the zone of decay. So it makes the land values there very, very high. Now, it's puzzling because you say that this area has got old buildings, it's decaying, but why are the land values high here? It's because as the CBD expands, it's going to expand into this zone of decay. Hence, it is being renewed, or renovated from time to time. Let's go on. Now, let us look at factors that determine the location of, remember, the heavy industries. Now, as we look at our imaginary city here, we're going to see that there's an area that is designated for industries. But now, what is it? Why are these industries located here? It is because the area has got, the area is level in itself. Number two factor is that, do you see the area is close to transport routes for everything to be transported? It is possible for anything that is produced here to be transported. There's a railway line. Do you see it close to the railway line? There's an airport. And remember, we said that obviously this will mean this area is the rural urban fringe zone. Remember? We said that's where we find such activities like the airport. And then again, there's the river. Remember, industries have to be close to the water source. Remember? Now this is the river. So this industrial zone, it's heavy industry. its location has been determined by number 1, the area is level, it's flat, there is transport routes that pass next to it, and there's water, because industries require water. They need water for their production. Anything that has to be produced relies on water. And then there's my road again. Do you see the road? Yes, there's the main road. So this is an ideal location for heavy industries. What am I saying? I am saying to you, industries need to be close to the main roads, or they need to be close to the transport routes. In this case, we have the road, the main road that leads to the CBD, and away from the CBD, we have the railroad. We have the railroad. And then we have the airport, and then we have water. And the most important thing, there's fuel. There's a power station. Remember, industries cannot function without what? Without power. So there's the power station close to the industries. So it says industries are located where they are because of these factors. And the last important factor will be people. Remember, for industries to function, they need to have labor. So what is labor? There's residential areas there. See these residential areas. These people stay here and they work at the industries. Remember? So these are the factors. What am I saying? We are saying for industries to be located where they are, they need labor. So they have to be close to their labor source. They have to be close to the source of energy. In this case, we have a power station. They have to be close to the transport routes. And then they need a source of water. They have to be close to the source of water. And again, they need level land. That is that. Can I go on? Yes. And then they have to be close to the market. Remember, in this case, the market will be the CBD, where they sell whatever they are producing. Now, remember we said zone of decay, it's outside the CBD. Now, can you see zone of decay? That's an example. There's dilapidated buildings. Look at the cards. An old car, it's been parked there for 20 years, I'm sure. It's not really a nice scene. But unfortunately, this is found close to the CBD. Look at the shops here. They are closed. Can you see that? Then we say this is decaying. And then let's go on. Now, what's happening here? Yes, we say this has to be renovated. We're going to reduce the housing density. And remember, we said the rent is expensive here. Now, let us look at the residential areas. Can you see there's a high income residential, a beautiful house, nice view. Look at that. That's my house. So I just took a picture of my house just to show you that it's a high income residential area. We find these away from it has to be away from the CBD. Now, you cannot really build such a nice house and walk and be a pedestrian, you see. So we can build away from the center because we can afford transport. We can travel to and fro the city center, and we want to be away from the noise that is found in the CBD and the pollution that we find there. So high income residential areas are away from the CBD. They have people who commute. We call these people commuters. They come in and out the city center. Most of the people work at the city center, so they can afford that because they have transport, and they are located away from the noise and the pollution that is caused in the CBD. And these houses are beautiful. There's a nice view. Now, let us look at this one now. Look, we have again the closer, the middle income residential area. What's important about the residential areas in a city is that we divide them according to what? To income. We have high income away from the CBD, middle income just closer to the CBD, and then we have low income residential areas. Look at that. I think you remember these are RDP houses that we find here. And again, remember guys, there's low income residential areas that are away from the CBD, or that were built high, long ago in the olden days with the townships. Remember, every city has got, you have a city that has a township. Why? Because these townships were referred to as low-income residential areas for people who would work, who worked in the industrial areas in the city, people who worked in the industrial areas. Now, there's again now, what has come to place now of late is that in cities we have what we call informal settlements. If you look at the picture, you're going to notice that there's quite a lot of buildings there. If we care to call them buildings, but there's a lot of shacks, in fact, here. There's shacks. Now, how do we know that these are informal settlements? Look, the pattern is not even planned. The buildings appear not to be planned. They're just close to each other. They're just high density of shacks. Now, this is a result because there's overcrowding in cities. So there's shortage of space. And then these people, the building material that they use is corrugated iron. They just take anything and just build because they need space. And most of the people here are people who are trying to find work, employment in cities, are people who have came in. Remember, there's overcrowding, there's shortage of space, and then they have these settlements built around on the edges of cities. You know them, you know, we have those Chris Hani, the Mandelas, the Joe Slovo Parks, everything. These are informal settlements that we have next to the city. Right, let's go on. Now, the other area that we have to look at is the rural urban fringe. Remember, we said the rural urban fringe is on the outskirts. It's between the rural area and the urban area. Now, let's look at Bloemfontein. There's a golf course. Can you see the rural urban fringe? There's the golf course there. There's the sewage. Most of the activities that we find in the rural urban fringe are what's here. Look, there's the sewage works. There's the golf course. And then look here. This is shunting yard there. And then there's the race course. It's out of what? Of the CBD. There's the Bloemfontein Airport. Can you see the airport here? Yes, this is an area that we say is the rural urban fringe. Why do we have such things here? Why do we have the race course here? Why do we have Bloemfontein Airport at the rural urban fringe? Why do we have the golf course? Because these activities that are here, they require a lot of space, remember? And like an airport, it causes a lot of noise. So it's away from the city. From the CBD, in fact. Now let's go on. And then there, rural urban fringe, rural urban, you see those things that we identified, the race course, the golf course again, there's a recreational area there, and then the sewage dams, all these things we said we find, and that is the rural urban fringe zone. Let's go on. Now, we are going to have to take another break. But before we do that, let us just look at things that we're going to discuss as we come back. We're going to look at types of cities as we come back. But let me just stress this point that the rural urban fringe zone, what do I expect to find at the rural urban fringe zone? I expect to find activities like an airport, the race course. Do you see sewage dams? That's where they clean all the waste here. And then you have the golf course. That is the rural urban fringe zone. So let us recap. We said the residential areas have been divided into three. We have a high income residential area, and then we have a middle income residential area, and then we have a low-income residential area. We classify them according to income. And what has come to being now is that there are what we call informal settlements. Before we go on, when you come back from the break, I would like us to have an in-depth discussion on informal settlements. What are the problems that these people find here, people who live in informal settlements, and what is it that we can do to solve the problems that people in informal settlements find. For now, we're just going to take a 10-minute break again, and then we'll meet each other when we come back. Thank you.